The storm was a cruel herald of the end, lightning tearing through the sky as armored knights charged through the torrential downpour. The rain was a terrible, suffocating shroud that day, masking the screams echoing within the royal castle of Roan. It was a day of tragedy that struck just before a young princess's 9th birthday, shattering a world of warmth and family. Small feet raced across the cold marble, the hem of a lavender dress fluttering in a desperate, frantic rhythm. Richelotte, the princess of Roan, burst into the room with wide, terrified eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her older brother, Emilio, turned toward her, his face a mask of pale concern as he confirmed the nightmare. He tried to soothe her, insisting it was a mistake, reminding her that Prince Alexis of Ostdin was her fiance. But the warmth of his hand on her head could not still her trembling. He commanded her to flee castle immediately, his voice heavy with the weight of a final goodbye. Emilio chose to stay behind, a sacrificial lamb, hoping to clear a misunderstanding that was already written in blood. He entrusted his sister to Lance, a loyal knight whose eyes mirrored the grim reality of their situation. With a sudden, jarring motion, Lance swept the princess into his arms, ignoring her desperate cries for her brother as he raced into the shadows. Emilio's silhouette grew smaller, a ghost of the life she was leaving behind. They plunged into the darkness of a secret passage, their breath coming in ragged gasps. But the enemy was already upon them, a guard's shout cutting through the gloom like a blade. Lance cursed, his body shifting instinctively to shield the small girl behind him. A flash of steel followed, and blood erupted, painting the air a sickening crimson as Lance took a hit for his princess. Richelotte's world blurred into a nightmare of splattered gore, the white lace of her dress stained with the lifeblood of her protector. Lance's voice was a strained rasp, pleading with her to close her eyes, his hands shaking as he held her close. He vowed to get them through the carnage, his eyes burning with protective light. Princess's anguish tore from her throat in a silent scream as she watched her kingdom fall. She was a child lost in a sea of terror, wondering if her own life would be the next to be extinguished. Behind them, the king was captured, and the halls of Roan became a slaughterhouse. Lance carried her through the rain, his own injuries forgotten in the face of her safety. The tragedy was absolute. The king of Roan was brutally murdered in an act of retaliatory betrayal. The queen took her own life in despair, and the crown prince was executed shortly after. The world believed the young princess had vanished into the chaos of war, her memory washed away by the storm. Years passed in the quiet refuge of the Republic of Canarie. The girl who once a princess now sat at a simple table, her identity buried under the name Liana. She spent her days cleaning floors and her nights dreaming of blood. But within her, a cold fire burned. She trained with a wooden sword until her hands bled, her eyes hardening with a single-minded purpose: revenge. The child was gone, replaced by a woman with hair like silver silk and eyes like cold sapphires. Liana, the brilliant military strategist of the Canarie Republic, stood with a poise that commanded respect. Beside her stood Lance, now a division commander, his statuesque frame still radiating the same protective aura. When the call came for an envoy to the Ostdin Empire, Liana did not hesitate to volunteer, despite Lance's frantic warnings of the danger. She knew the risks better than anyone, but the chance to get close to the emperor was a siren song she could not ignore. Returning to the land that stole everything from her, Liana walked through the opulent gates of the Ostdin Palace. Every step was a gamble, her heart a drumbeat of anticipation and dread. As the grand doors to the audience chamber swung open, she felt the air grow thin. Sitting upon the throne was not the aging emperor, but a man of godlike beauty and chilling presence. Prince Alexis, her former fiance, looked down at the delegation with eyes as cold as ice. Liana's breath hitched. He was no longer the kind boy she once knew. In her memory, he was a gentle soul who had once knelt before her when she was only 4. A boy who had looked at her with warmth and called her his proper princess. He had once picked a flower petal from her hair, telling her its color matched his eyes and that it suited her far better than any crown. That Alex had melted for her, his cheeks flushing with a youthful, innocent love. Now, the man before her was a stranger, his expression a fortress of indifference. Liana lowered her gaze, her pulse thundering as his eyes swept over her. When he questioned the presence of a woman among the knights, she felt the weight of his suffocating gaze. Lance stood tense beside her as her achievements were recited, a shield against the prince's scrutiny. Alexis showed no sign of recognition, his voice void of any warmth as he dismissed the formalities. Liana retreated to her quarters, the urge to scream the truth clawing at her throat. She stared out at the sunset, the sky the same color as the fires that consumed Roan. She had survived to expose the truth and restore her family's honor, a war that had never ended for her. Meanwhile, in the heart of the palace, Alexis grappled with his own burdens. The emperor's health was a failing secret, and the weight of the expanding empire rested solely on the prince's shoulders. He knew he could show no weakness to the vultures circling the throne. Alexis visited his father's sickbed, where the emperor's eyes glowed with a lingering, murderous ambition. The old man cared nothing for peace, only for crushing neighboring nations like Sable and drawing Canarie into his web. Alexis bowed his head in obedience, a cold tool of his father's will. Yet, as he left the room, a heavy sigh escaped his lips, the mask of the tyrant slipping for a fleeting second. He found his thoughts drifting back to the silver-haired knight in the delegation, a strange curiosity stirring in his frozen heart. As the envoy's stay drew to a close, Lance pleaded with Liana to return to the safety of Canarie. But the news of a potential invasion of Sable changed everything. Liana realized that the friendship treaty was a sham, a trap to force her new home into a bloody war. She could not let history repeat itself. She would not let another tragedy like Roan befall the innocent. With her fist clenched and her eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding resolve, she made her choice. Looking at Lance, she declared her intention to stay in Ostdin, walking directly into the lion's den to face the man she once loved and the empire she vowed to destroy. Aimed. Lance's voice cracked with a mixture of fear and disbelief as he demanded to know why she would choose to remain in a place as dangerous as Ostdin. Liana's eyes remained steady, her heart heavy with the memory of her fallen home, as she explained that gathering information from within was the only way to prevent Canarie from suffering the same fiery fate as the countries before it. She refused to be a bystander while others lost their families, her determination a shield against Lance's desperate pleas to let someone else carry the burden. Though he argued that a short mission was one thing, this extended stay was a descent into a lion's den. Liana stood her ground, her voice a soft but unbreakable vow that she was no longer a helpless child. Lance warned her that the Empire would never truly accept a female knight, and that she would find herself surrounded by predators in every corridor. She merely tightened her fist, her resolve as sharp as a blade. As a strategist, she would be the first to see the enemy's move. A weary sigh escaped Lance as he realized his were failing. Yet he couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for the woman who took full responsibility for her own perilous path. He vowed to speak with the commander, his protective instinct flaring even as she walked away with a grace that belied the storm within. When the day of departure finally arrived, the golden spires of the palace seemed to mock the tension brewing in Liana's chest. Among the returning knights, 5 were chosen to remain as envoys, a request Prince Alexis had personally granted despite the heavy prejudice of the imperial order. The prince's gaze was a cold, impenetrable mystery as he noted how peculiar it was for a woman to volunteer for such a station. He dismissively remarked that she need not participate in training, but Liana countered with the quiet steel of a strategist who knew her worth. Behind her, Lance steeled himself, a silent shadow committed to guarding her at any cost. Life in the Ostdin Empire began under a sky that felt too bright for the weight of her mission. Liana threw herself into her duties, even as the commander of the Night Order sought to break her spirit with menial labor. His eyes were narrow and filled with a simmering disdain as he commanded her to clean the 3rd warehouse yet again. Despite her internal flare of annoyance, she kept her mask of professionalism tight, ignoring the petty harassment that sent her marching toward the edge of the palace grounds. It was there, in the quiet solitude of a sun-drenched gazebo, that she stumbled upon a sight that made her breath hitch. A man lay sleeping in the dappled light, his features so regal they seemed carved from marble. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized it was Prince Alexis himself, resting without a single guard in sight. As he stirred and opened his eyes, the air between them grew heavy and suffocating. He demanded to know who she was, his voice like velvet over ice. Liana quickly offered a deep bow, her mind racing as she apologized for the intrusion. He recognized her and the knight from Canarie, and she introduced herself with a name that should have meant everything to him. Yet his expression remained frustratingly blank. A painful memory of an old engagement, words kept deep in her heart, threatened to spill out as she looked at the man who had once been her future. He questioned her presence there, and she admitted she was merely following orders to clean the nearby warehouse. A flicker of something crossed his godlike face as she warned him of the dangers of being alone in a palace full of grudges. With a small, confident smile, he gestured to the sword at his side, a silent testament to his own lethality. He pinned her with a gaze that felt like a trial, asking why she had come to a country that held no place for women. Liana felt the suffocating weight of his suspicion but held her head high, claiming she wished to learn tactics so as not to be a burden. When he pressed for her surname, the truth was a bitter pill. She told him she had none, that she was merely an orphan. He seemed to acknowledge her hard life before checking his watch and departing with a simple command to work hard. As his silhouette faded, Liana collapsed into a crouch, her lungs finally finding air. It was clear he didn't recognize the girl he had been promised to, the survivor of the Kingdom of Roan. Her parents had been accused of betrayal, their lives snuffed out without a chance to explain, a truth Liana refused to accept. She remembered him as a boy in a field of flowers, a memory that clashed violently with the cold man he had become. Just as she moved to leave, a glint on the stone bench caught her eye, a deep blue gemstone necklace, a treasure famous in the fallen Roan. Her blood ran cold as she realized Alexis had been carrying a piece of her history. Back in her room that night, the jewel glowed like a fragment of a lost star. Why would the prince of the empire possess such a thing? The mystery followed her into her day off, where Lance tried to distract her with the lively energy of the capital. In the market, she found herself admiring Melgus ware, products from another nation destroyed by the Empire. The merchant's praise for Alexis's economic reforms stung. It seemed the people of fallen lands were content with their new lives, even if the royal families remained haunted by regret. Liana steeled her heart. Her battle was for the truth, no matter how much the world wanted to forget. Their quiet afternoon was shattered by the arrival of a lavish carriage and the sudden appearance of the knight commander. Beside him stood Lady Sharon, a woman of such staggering, fiery beauty that Liana felt a momentary pang of intimidation. Sharon's smile was sharp and condescending as she questioned why the order would ever need a woman. Liana answered with a dignity that refused to buckle, though Sharon's cold departure left a lingering chill. Returning to the training grounds, Liana was relegated to odd jobs once more, her presence a target for the commander's relentless bullying. But the atmosphere shifted instantly when Prince Alexis strode onto the field, his presence commanding the very air. He asked for a report on their progress, and when Liana hesitantly admitted she had been doing nothing worse, his eyes darkened with a terrifying intensity. He confronted the commander directly, his voice dropping to a lethal octave as he ordered Liana to be treated as a strategist immediately, in accordance with their treaty. As the prince turned to leave, Liana watched him with wide, trembling eyes, wondering if he had truly stepped in to save her. Behind them, the commander's face contorted with a murderous rage, his hatred for the meddlesome woman finally reaching a breaking point. Sund. The sun cast long shadows over the imperial palace as a high-stakes tactical meeting commenced within its gilded walls. Prince Alexis sat at the head of the table, his presence as cold and unyielding as a statue of ice, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a suffocating intensity. Liana felt the weight of every gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird as she prepared to prove her worth in a den of lions. She knew the knights were waiting for her to stumble, their eyes sharp enough to cut, but she steeled her resolve, determined to show them she belonged. With a steady hand, she pointed to the maps spread across the table, her voice clear as she laid out the strategies that had once protected a fallen kingdom. Alexis watched her with a newfound depth in his eyes, his initial skepticism melting into genuine interest as the weight of her genius became undeniable. A soft sense of triumph bloomed in Liana's chest when she saw the imperial knights leaning forward, their faces losing their mask of disdain. After the meeting concluded, the heavy air in the room finally lifted, and Alexis approached her, his voice dropping an octave as he praised her brilliant performance. For the first time, a genuine, heart-fluttering smile graced the tyrant's lips, catching Liana completely off guard. She offered a humble bow, her voice trembling slightly as she thanked him for the opportunity to serve as a staff officer. Her eyes sparkled with a rare, unguarded joy, unaware of how much her radiance was beginning to thaw the frozen heart of the prince. Alexis promised that he would personally ensure no one treated their guests with such discourtesy again, his protective nature flaring. Liana felt a jolt of realization, her eyes widening as she looked at him. She remembered the cold reception she had first received from the Knight Order, and realized that the prince had been aware of the harassment all along. The weight of his quiet protection made her heart skip a beat, her mind racing with questions about his true intentions. Suddenly, the very knights who had once sneered at her approached with bright faces, eager to discuss the tactics she had shared. Liana could hardly believe the shift in atmosphere, her blue eyes shimmering with a mix of relief and surprise. She graciously agreed to help them with their training regimens, her smile warming the room. Even Lance, her constant support, looked on with a proud and gentle expression. However, in the shadows, a hostile commander watched her success with a bitter, tooth-grinding jealousy. As the days passed, Liana became a fixture in the order, her presence softening the rough edges of the knights, while Alexis continued to drop by more frequently than ever. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, Liana sat in her room, the soft glow of the lamp hitting a mysterious Roan gemstone. She turned the jewel over in her hands, her brow furrowed as she wondered why Alexis would have something so precious from her lost homeland. The mystery gnawed at her, a silent tether connecting her past to this intimidating man. Seeking answers, she clutched the jewel and headed into the palace gardens. The setting sun bathed the roses in a golden fire as she walked through the manicured paths. She moved with a quiet grace, her ponytail swaying with every step. Ahead, she spotted a lone figure seated in a marble gazebo. It was Alexis, looking statuesque and lonely against the fading light, his thoughts seemingly miles away. He sensed her presence and spoke, his voice carrying on the cool evening breeze. Liana approached him, her pulse quickening with every step as she entered its sanctuary. She felt a sudden rush of heat to her cheeks, her internal monologue a frantic mess as she worried her presence might be misinterpreted. She looked like a flustered child for a moment, her hands fidgeting in her pockets. Swallowing her nerves, she reached out and produced the gemstone. She explained that she had found it and believed it belonged to him. Alexis reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took the necklace, a look of profound relief washing over his godlike features. They stood together in the soft twilight, the silence between them no longer heavy, but filled with an unspoken tension. He confessed that the stone was worth more to him than any jewel in the Empire, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Liana watched him, her heart aching with a strange familiarity as she wondered about the secrets he held. Alexis shifted the conversation to her work, his gaze softening as he looked at her. She spoke of her expanding duties, her passion for her work shining through. He watched her every expression, his admiration clear as he noted that her success was a testament to her own skill. Liana's face flushed a deep crimson at the sincerity in his voice, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She quickly took her leave. Her steps hurried as she tried to escape the intensity of his gaze. Alexis stayed behind, his eyes following her figure until she disappeared into the shadows of the mansion. Night fell over the estate. But the peace was short-lived. In a dark corner of the palace, Lady Sharon sat with her father, her red hair like a spill of blood against her pale skin. She hid her venomous smile behind an ornate fan, her eyes narrowing as she heard of the prince's interest in the little knight. Preparations for the upcoming soiree began, and Liana found herself being fitted for a gown, a far cry from her usual stiff uniforms. She felt exposed and vulnerable, her skin prickling under the seamstress's touch. Suddenly, Sharon swept into the room, her presence as suffocating as a heavy perfume. Liana stood frozen, her blue eyes wide with wariness as the noblewoman approached. Sharon played the part of a kind sister, insisting that Liana wear a dress she had chosen. She reminded Liana that as a marquis's daughter, her offer was not one to be refused. She spoke of budgets and diplomacy, her words like silk hiding a sharp blade. Liana felt cornered, unable to find a way to decline the suspicious generosity. Sharon looked at her with a chillingly sweet smile, claiming she simply wanted to see Liana in a dress. She took Liana's hands in hers, commenting on their roughness and the evidence of her hard life. With a calculated grace, Sharon pulled out a dress that was purposefully plain and muted. She warned Liana that as a female knight, wearing something too flashy would only invite scandalous rumors about her trying to snag a man. Liana paled, the fear of public humiliation and rumors about her and the prince making her easy to manipulate. She thanked Sharon, falling right into the trap of looking like a servant compared to the high-born ladies. Back at the training grounds, the knights were abuzz with excitement for the party, unaware of the storms brewing. They whispered of the emperor's failing health and the rumors that he had not been seen in months. They noted that Alexis was already the true power in the capital, the seat of the empire, effectively his. Liana listened, her mind drifting to the political chess match she was now a part of. She thought of the fall of her home and how the truth of that night was buried in darkness. Deep within the palace, the air was stagnant in the emperor's chambers. The curtains were drawn tight against the world. The emperor lay in bed, a ghost of a man with sunken eyes and a frail voice. Marquis Belle, Sharon's father, stood by his side, his face a mask of loyal concern that didn't reach his cold eyes. The emperor clutched at his sheets, his life force fading. Outside the sick room, Bardel met with Alexis, the tension between them thick enough to choke. Bardel's eyes were sharp, calculating the prince's every move. He asked if Alexis had chosen a partner for the soiree, his tone deceptively casual. He then suggested his own daughter, Sharon, claiming she greatly admired the prince. Alexis looked away, his expression unreadable as he considered the political necessity of the match. Bardel pressed him, reminding him that the empire needed a consort and a stable line of succession given the emperor's state. Alexis's jaw tightened, the weight of the crown already pressing down on him, as he realized he had no choice but to agree. Bardel left with a triumphant glint in his eyes, the trap for the evening perfectly set. The night of the soiree finally arrived, the palace glowing like a jewel under the moonlight. Liana gasped as a maid pulled her corset tight, the fabric digging into her ribs until she could barely breathe. She looked into the mirror, seeing a stranger in the blue silk, a woman who looked far more like a princess than a soldier. She stood alone in her room, her heart racing as the hour approached. A knock at the door revealed Lance, who stopped dead in his tracks, his breath hitching at the sight of her. He looked at her with a reverence that made Liana blush. In his mind, he saw the radiant princess she was meant to be, a woman of dignity and grace who had survived the unthinkable. Liana asked if the dress was too plain, her voice small. Lance forward and opened a velvet box, revealing a stunning set of jewels. He insisted she wear them, telling her that since she would never treat herself, he would do it for her. He gently placed the necklace around her neck, his touch light as a feather. Liana looked at her reflection, the jewels catching the light and making her blue eyes pop, her heart swelling with gratitude for his kindness. Lance offered his arm, and they headed toward the grand ballroom. The palace was a sea of light and music, the air filled with the scent of expensive wine and flowers. Liana entered the ballroom, her eyes wide at the sheer opulence of the imperial gathering. Suddenly, the crowd parted and her heart shattered. Alexis was there, looking more godlike than ever, but he was not alone. Sharon clung to his arm, her dress the exact same shade of blue as Liana's, but hers was a masterpiece of lace and diamonds that made Liana's look like a cheap imitation. Liana realized with a sickening jolt that Sharon had planned this to make her look like a lowly maid in the prince's presence. The crowd whispered, noting that the seat of the empress was vacant and Sharon was clearly the frontrunner. Alexis and Sharon moved through the room like the sun and moon, the perfect imperial couple. Sharon glanced back at Liana, a smirk of pure malice dancing on her lips. Alexis finally turned and spotted Liana standing by the pillar. He froze, his violet eyes widening as he took in her beauty, the world around him fading away. Sharon felt his shift in attention and her face twisted with a momentary flash of rage. Her eyes burned with a murderous light as she saw the way the prince looked at the girl she had tried to bury. Leaning in, Sharon whispered a passive-aggressive threat, her voice a poisonous honey, as she suggested this might be Liana's last soiree. Alexis, however, could only see Liana, a small, genuine smile breaking through his cold mask. He moved toward her, leaving Sharon fuming in his wake. Sharon watched them, her hands clenching into claws as she made a dark, silent vow. She would make Liana regret ever humiliating her, her heart consumed by a jealousy that promised only ruin. The silver moon hung heavy over the silent palace, yet inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of perfume and unspoken rivalries. Liana stood tall in her sapphire gown, a vision of grace that felt entirely out of place among the snakes of the court. She felt the weight of many eyes, but none were as sharp as the group of noble women who approached her with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They questioned her identity with a mocking sweetness, their gazes scanning her for any sign of weakness. Lance, ever the faithful shield, stepped in to offer her comfort, his hand steady as he took her glass. He felt the sting of their judgment, knowing they viewed a commoner knight as nothing more than a stain on the polished floor. Their lives like shards of glass. But as the orchestra began its swell, Lance pulled her into a dance that silenced the room. They moved as one, a whirlwind of blue and white that drew gasps from the onlookers. High above the crowd, Prince Alexis watched them, his expression a mask of marble. His heart constricted as he looked at Liana. She was a haunting echo of Richelotte, the sweet princess he had lost. Memories of a simpler time, when an innocent girl adored him, flooded his mind, only to be drowned by the vivid, terrifying image of blood and thorns that haunted his nightmares. He gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles white with the memory of his own helplessness. Watching Liana smile, he saw strength that Richelotte never had, yet the resemblance was enough to make his blood run cold. When the ambitious Sharon tried to claim his attention, he dismissed her with a gaze so frigid it felt like a physical blow. Sharon bowed in forced submission, her face burning with a resentment that promised future cruelty. Liana eventually retreated to the cool night air, her heart still racing from the ballroom's suffocating heat. On the quiet balcony, the mask of the stoic knight finally slipped. She confessed her exhaustion to Lance, her voice a mere whisper against the wind. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, realizing in the soft moonlight just how much she had grown. The night air carried the weight of history, and Lance found himself speaking of the night everything changed. He remembered the final, desperate command of Lord Emerio, a memory that made Liana's eyes wide with a sudden, sharp pain. The darkness of the past seemed to seep into the present. He could still see Emerio's face, pale and resolute, as he ordered Lance to save the little princess at any cost. Emerio's voice had been a roar of desperation, and young Lance had taken that burden onto his shoulders. He had promised to protect her life with his own. She wiped away a tear, moved by a devotion that went deeper than duty. Lance told her she was reckless and stubborn, yet in his eyes, she was more beautiful than any crown jewel. No matter what titles she held or lost, to him, she would always be his princess. The next morning, the palace facade remained as grand as ever, but Liana felt a new presence watching her. Roderick Bardel, the formidable Minister of Military Affairs, introduced himself with a chillingly polite smile. Liana felt a jolt of recognition. This was Sharon's father, a man whose name was synonymous with the Empire's aggressive expansion. He watched her with the calculating gaze of a predator, leaving her with a sense of impending dread. Meanwhile, at the Bardel estate, Sharon fumed over her failure to capture the prince's heart. Her father remained unmoved, his eyes cold as he assured her that a commoner knight could never truly sway a royal. He promised to make her empress, his smirk revealing a bottomless ambition. Back at the training grounds, the tension was of a different sort as Liana faced a fellow knight over a chessboard. He laughed softly, her mind sharp as she moved her knight into position. When Alexis himself entered the fray, he challenged to a match that felt more like a duel of souls. He looked at her with a gaze that could melt ice, and even Liana felt a blush creep up her neck. He would be delighted to play, his handsome face illuminated by a sudden, genuine interest. Liana's heart hammered against her ribs as she sat across from him. They played in a silence that was charged with electricity. He asked if she was comfortable, and for a moment the cold tyrant seemed to vanish, replaced by a man who was truly glad for her presence. He found her intriguing, a woman who did not shrink before his intimidating aura like the others. Lance watched them from the shadows, his eyes full of a protective jealousy. Alexis noticed the knight's concern, labeling him a worrywart, but Liana only smiled, thinking of the shared past that bound them together. As the game reached its climax, Alexis challenged her to show her next move. Liana saw a flicker of the old Alexis in his eyes, the boy who used to spar with her brother. A bittersweet mix of joy and sadness washed over her. She saw the path to victory, and hesitated, wondering if it was wise to defeat the ruler of the land. Sensing her doubt, Alexis simply smiled and conceded the win. A rematch, his voice dropping an octave. But the peace was shattered when a messenger arrived with a secret. Alexis leaned in to hear the report, and the word sable caught Liana's ear like a strike of lightning. She wondered what could have happened in a land so close to war. Alexis left with a sudden, urgent gravity, leaving only a brief goodbye. Liana watched him go, her heart heavy with the fear of a looming conflict. She hoped with all her soul that war was not upon them. Later, a fellow knight asked about the match, and Liana realized that Alexis's concessions were not just about chess. She discovered he had secretly issued orders to spare her from the grueling training. The realization that he was being so deeply considerate made her heart flutter with a warmth she couldn't explain. She smiled to herself, touched by his hidden kindness, before heading out to her duties. While patrolling the capital, she reflected on how much her perception of him had changed. He had seemed so cold, yet every word they exchanged revealed the man he used to be. He was calm and concerned for his people, and she saw him treasuring the jewels of her fallen kingdom as if they were his own heart. He seemed to treasure the memory of Roan, and Liana began to believe that he had never wanted her home to fall. She wished she could find the courage to ask him the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted by the knight commander, who looked at her with his usual sternness. He gave her a proper task at last to patrol the city and assess its defenses. Liana suspected this, too, was a result of Alexis's influence. She set out with Lance through the prosperous streets, the city appearing peaceful and well-ordered. The regular patrol seemed effective, and Liana's confidence grew as she moved through the crowds. She wondered if the commander was truly testing her or simply giving her a chance to prove her worth. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm. A young boy looked up at her with desperate eyes, calling her a knight and begging for help. Liana, despite not being a knight, couldn't ignore his plea. The child through the winding streets, led deeper into a dark, narrow alley. A sense of unease settled in her gut as the light faded. She looked around, realizing too late that the child was leading her into a trap. 3 large men emerged from the shadows, their faces etched with a predatory intent. They loomed over her, their presence suffocating. Liana told the boy to get back, but the child simply threw a bag of coins to the thugs. It was a setup. She was surrounded. And the men confirmed she was the foreign knight they had been told to find. Recognized her hair and eyes. Liana's heart hammered against her ribs. She realized she had been lured here on purpose. She gripped her sword, but she knew that drawing it first could trigger a diplomatic disaster. As the lead thug reached out a hand to seize her, Liana's eyes widened in a panic she couldn't hide, trapped in a game where the stakes were far higher than any chessboard. The shadows of the alleyway seemed to reach out with a physical weight as a hand suddenly darted toward her. Her breath hitched as she was violently seized by the arm, her heart hammering against her ribs like a panicked bird while she demanded her release. Just as the situation threatened to spiral into a bloody confrontation, Lance's voice cut through the air like a blade, his eyes burning with a protective fury that sent the thugs scurrying back into the darkness to avoid the local knights. The lead criminal cast a final, lingering look of malice over his shoulder before the sound of retreating footsteps signaled their temporary safety, leaving Lance to frantically check for any sign of injury. Overwhelmed by the sudden brush with danger, she offered a shaky word of gratitude, only to be pulled into a crushing embrace that smelled of leather and steel. He held her as if she might vanish, his body a solid wall of warmth that finally allowed her trembling to subside. Safe in his arms, her mind raced with the terrifying possibility that a public fight could have destabilized the entire kingdom. She realized she had to be more than just a survivor. She had to be a ghost in the imperial territory to avoid a scene. Lance's voice was thick with regret as he apologized for leaving her side even for a moment. But she took the blame upon herself, cursing the carelessness that had made her forget the danger of the capital. They stood together in the quiet street, a statuesque pair bound by secrets. She looked up at him, her sapphire eyes softening as she confessed that his voice alone had brought her a peace she hadn't known she lost. Her heart fluttered as she thanked him for his unwavering presence, watching as the cold mask he wore for the world melted into a gaze of profound tenderness. He promised to always be there, though a sudden, awkward cough broke the heavy tension between them. He sternly reminded her to never let her guard down again. As they made their way toward the Night Order's quarters, her thoughts remained heavy with the weight of the unknown. Lance noticed the shadow in her eyes and pressed for the truth. She whispered that the attacks weren't a random mugging. Those men were predators specifically hunting her. She recalled their faces, realizing they had used children as bait because they viewed her as nothing more than a fragile woman. It was clear someone had ordered her capture, someone who knew she was an outsider. The suspicion toward the head of the Night Order himself. If she were to be attacked now, the blame would fall on her own head first. The bustling city streets felt like a maze of hidden threats, and she felt the invisible weight of countless eyes tracking her every move. Someone was intent on her destruction. Lance stood in silent contemplation, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave as he suggested that someone might have pierced her disguise. The thought that her true identity was compromised sent a jolt of ice through her veins. While the prince remained oblivious, the emperor and his inner circle were far more dangerous. They would remember the face of the lost princess, and her resemblance to the child she once was a death sentence. Lance urged her to flee back to Canarie once the mission was over, but she refused, her spirit burning with the need to finish what she started. He pleaded with her to trust only him, for if she fell, their entire cause would crumble. She swore to keep his warning in her heart. Days bled into weeks as she immersed herself in the lion's den, eventually presenting her strategic reports to the very man she suspected. He seemed satisfied, his cold eyes betraying nothing as he praised her work. Passed in a blur of tension and political maneuvering. The palace walls stood as a gilded cage, and her thoughts often drifted to the ruins of her homeland Roan. Her eyes grew sharp with the memory of the betrayal that had branded her family as traitors. She remembered her 9-year-old self in a political storm she couldn't understand. Her parents were noble souls, and she was determined to tear the lies from the history books. Her resolve was interrupted when a messenger from Prince Alexis approached her. He presented a formal invitation, and her eyes widened as she read the request for her presence at a tea party. It was a strange summons, and she thanked him while her mind whirled with suspicion. The invitation was from a noblewoman named Mabel, but the location was the palace gardens. Such events were rarely held on imperial grounds, and she realized the prince himself had orchestrated this meeting. She wondered if his godlike eyes were watching her even then. Back in her chambers, the weight of the coming confrontation pressed upon her. The lost secrets of Roan, and the emperor who sat upon a throne of lies. Lance arrived at her door, sensing the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. He leaned in, his proximity making her breath hitch as he noted her distracted state. She admitted he could read her better than anyone, her eyes on the setting sun as she mourned for the past. She worried her obsession was becoming a burden to him. Lance's gaze was piercing as he linked her current assignment to the simmering conflict with Sable. The path to proving her family's innocence was a mountain of thorns. She claimed the accusations of treason were utter nonsense, and her desire to seek out witnesses from the past sparked a flash of anger in Lance. He commanded her to stop, his voice booming with the fear of losing her. He slammed his hand down, declaring he would handle the investigation himself to keep her safe. He couldn't bear the thought of her walking into another trap. He spoke of the merchants who had seen the Empire's preparations for war, proving that the invasion had been calculated long in advance. In this empire, a single word from the tyrant could ignite a world in flames. The records had been burned to ash to hide the truth. Lance insisted on a slow, careful approach through the Night Order, warning her to stay away from the prince's inner circle. He made her promise to consult him before taking any risks. Looking into his emerald eyes, she saw a man genuinely terrified for her life. She clenched her fist, promising to be his shadow and act with caution. Finally, of the tea party arrived. She stepped into the garden wearing a gown of soft green, looking every bit the noblewoman she was born to be. Mabel greeted her with a practiced smile, and she played the part of the gracious guest. She remembered the woman's previous attempts to engage her. A red-haired lady joined them, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. The air grew thick with unspoken rivalries. FL felt the prickle of danger as the red-haired woman watched her every move. Caught a glimpse of Alexis in the distance. As the tea and delicate pastries were served, she focused on the millefeuille. Her hosts watched her like hawks, expecting a lapse in her commoner's disguise. Instead, she moved with a grace that could only be inherited, her etiquette flawless. Mabel watched in stunned silence as she handled the fork with precision. She savored the sweet cream and sipped her tea with the poise of a queen. Mabel was shaken to her core, realizing she was facing a true lady of the highest caliber. Memories of Lance's own prestigious rise flashed through her mind. Poise. He was a man of peerless skill and popularity. She wished for his happiness, even as she prepared for her own battle. The maid poured tea, and she noticed the liquid was unnaturally dark. Mabel's eyes were fixed on her. Taking a sip, her mouth was filled with a bitterness that nearly made her gag. She realized it was a petty act of sabotage, but if she complained, the innocent maid would be the one to suffer. With a seamless smile, she added milk and sugar, praising the blend for its richness and leaving Mabel fuming in silent defeat. Lady Sharon then turned the conversation toward her work, implying that a woman had no place in the knight's order. She met the insult with a cold, haughty stare, declaring she was an ordinary woman. The tension was a living thing between them. She knew these noble daughters were mere distractions from her true goals. When Mabel suggested a tour of the garden, she tried to finish her cake in one last moment of peace. But as she stood, she lost her footing. The world tilted, and the ladies gasped. Suddenly, a pair of strong arms caught her, pulling her against a broad, solid chest. She looked up, her heart stopping as she met the suffocating, godlike gaze of Lord Alexis. The sun bathed the palace grounds in a deceptive warmth as Lord Alexis stood tall, his statuesque presence commanding the very air around him. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a silken murmur as he requested a moment of Liana's time, leaving the ever-watchful Lady Sharon to simmer in a silent, jealous fury. As they walked away, the weight of the Empire's cold expectations followed them, mirrored in the icy, calculating gaze of those left behind. Liana felt her heart skip a beat as she followed him, the distance between them closing as they retreated into the sanctuary of the tea gardens. Sharon's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her hands clenching at her sides as she watched the man she coveted drift further from her reach. Beneath the shade of the gazebo, the prince's demeanor softened, his usual stoicism by a rare, haunting vulnerability as he offered a sincere apology for the rudeness Liana had endured. He watched her intently, noting how she lacked the fluttering nerves or calculated flirtations of other noblewomen. To him, she was a breath of fresh air, her gaze unwavering and composed, a stark contrast to the hollow shadows of the court. Yet, looking into her eyes, a sharp pang of grief pierced his heart. She reminded him so much of the lost Richelotte that it was almost suffocating. The memory of his failure to protect her surged back like a bitter tide, pulling him into the dark depths of the past. 10 years ago, the world had shattered for a young Alexis when the horrific news of Roan's invasion reached his ears. He had pleaded with his father, the Emperor, his small voice cracking with desperation as he begged for mercy for a kingdom already being swallowed by fire. His tiny fists had trembled with a helpless, righteous fury as he learned the imperial knights had already conquered the land in secret. The betrayal stung like a physical wound, and he had sprinted through the cold, echoing halls of the palace, desperate to find some sliver of hope. He burst into the throne room, where the emperor sat like a frozen god, indifferent to the destruction he had wrought. The report was final. The queen was dead by her own hand, the prince a prisoner, and Richelotte was reported dead amidst the carnage. The vision of her smiling face shattered in his mind like glass, leaving behind only the jagged shards of a regret that would haunt him for a decade. Back in the present, his eyes lingered on Liana with a newfound intensity, his voice a low, protective rumble as he promised to be her shield should trouble ever find her again. Liana felt a flutter of warmth in her chest, realizing that beneath the facade of a cold prince beat a heart that was gentle and kind. She found herself curious, her mind wandering to the politics of Roan and the aggressive threat of Sable, wondering if this man truly desired the peace he spoke of. Alexis spoke of avoiding war as the only righteous path, his eyes burning with a conviction that left Liana breathless. To lighten the mood, he offered her a key to the imperial library, hips quirked in a faint, rare smile as she beamed with a joy genuine it caught him off guard. They made plans to meet in secret, a quiet place where the prying eyes of the court could not reach them. As Liana stood alone later, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and budding affection. That night, the palace was a silhouette of opulence and secrets. Alexis visited his father, the emperor, who lay in bed like a dying lion, his power-hungry nature still simmering beneath his failing health. The prince's worry was palpable. With the emperor weakening, he knew the vultures of the court would soon begin to circle. The next day, the training grounds were alive with the sound of preparation, but Liana's thoughts were elsewhere. She was a bundle of nerves, her heart racing at the thought of her secret tryst. When Lance suddenly appeared, the shock nearly made her jump out of her skin. She brushed off his suspicions with a hurried excuse, her face flushing as she made a hasty retreat. Watched her go, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the secrets she was desperately trying to hide. As she ran toward her meeting, Liana was torn. Alexis was the son of the man who destroyed her world, yet she found herself praying for his safety. She reached the secluded spot, unaware that Lance was trailing her like a shadow. He found her discarded report, his heart sinking as he realized she had lied to him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of blood and gold, Lance's world came crashing down as he witnessed the secret meeting. He saw Liana with the prince, their heads bent close together over rare books, intimacy that felt like a betrayal. Alexis had brought her treasures of knowledge, his gaze softening as he watched her delight in the rare encyclopedias. Her smile was like a sunbeam, radiating a happiness she had never shown Lance. They were lost in their own world, the air between them thick with unspoken words and the scent of old parchment. From the shadows, Lance watched with a heart-wrenching jealousy, his fists clenching as he realized the woman he loved was being drawn into the orbit of his greatest enemy. Days passed, and the bustle of the founding ceremony took over the palace. Liana was assigned to guard the venue, her duty a heavy weight as news arrived that Alexis had gone to Sable with only a handful of guards. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. The risk was too great, the danger too real. Even Lance looked grim as they discussed the impending war and the prince's reckless bravery. Far away, Alexis rode through the rugged mountains, his face set in a mask of grim determination as he raced against the sunset to prevent further bloodshed. Liana reflected on his words, hoping against hope that he wasn't a liar, that his desire for peace was as real as the heat of his gaze. She found herself in the ironic position of praying for the safety of the Empire's prince, her heart at war with her heritage. Talking with the other guards, a chilling truth began to emerge about the fall of Roan. It hadn't been a long-planned strategy, but a sudden, hurried invasion orchestrated by the Minister of Military Affairs, Marquis Bardel. The target had been a secret until the very last moment, a betrayal that still stung the survivors. The realization that the mastermind behind the carnage was still in power sent a shiver down Liana's spine. On the day of the ceremony, the palace was a sea of color and cheering crowds. When Alexis appeared on the balcony, safe and uninjured, Liana felt a wave of relief so powerful it left her trembling. But the mood soured as the Emperor appeared, the man who had ordered the destruction of her family. Liana watched him with a cold, burning hatred, her hand clenching into a fist as the crowd cheered for the new peace treaty Alexis had secured from Sable. The people whispered of a future bride for the hero prince, pointing toward Lady Sharon as the perfect match. The thought of Alexis being tied to the Bardel family, the very architects of her misery, felt like a knife to the heart. Liana tried to remain steadfast, but a strange, nagging doubt began to pull at her soul. Late that night, while the rest of the palace slept, Alexis returned to the library, his mind haunted by the inconsistencies of the past. He searched through the dusty archives until he found the official account of Richelotte's death. The report stated her body was found in a burnt-out room, identified only by her jewelry by his brother, Emilio. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the portrait of the brother who supposedly cared for her so deeply. Something was horribly wrong. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. 10 years ago, he lacked the courage to question the truth, but now, looking into the darkness, he was determined to uncover the secrets buried in the ashes of Roan. The moon hung high over the silent academy as Liana sat bathed in the soft glow of a lantern, her long silver hair spilling over her shoulders like silk. She traced the spine of a borrowed book, her heart heavy with the realization that the time to return it drew near. As she turned the pages, her mind drifted back to a golden afternoon in the palace gardens. There, she had sat beside Prince Alexis, a man as statuesque and untouchable as marble, yet who seemed to soften in her presence. His violet eyes had searched hers, promising another meeting in 2 weeks' time, a secret shared between a knight and her prince. Alexis had looked thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the upcoming foundation ceremony as he planned their next encounter. That memory was a precious treasure, but in the cold reality of her room, Liana knew that Alexis was now the one overseeing the entire Empire's affairs. Once the book was returned, the fragile thread connecting them might snap forever. Her blue eyes clouded with a bittersweet longing as she contemplated how difficult it was to remain just a source of information when her heart began to beat a different rhythm. Days later, the sun blazed over the imperial gardens where Liana waited, her posture perfect and her hands clasped tightly over the book. When Alexis finally appeared, his presence was as commanding as a winter storm, yet he offered a rare apology for his tardiness. He seemed to read her thoughts, his voice dropping an octave as he offered her another volume, one he had selected specifically because he thought it'd bring her joy. Liana's breath hitched. This was no longer a mere transaction of knowledge. Alexis confessed that he had taken the book without thinking, driven only by the desire to see her smile, and for a moment the distance between them vanished. He admitted that talking to her was surprisingly easy, a breath of fresh air in his suffocating world. As they sat together, he expressed a deep wish that they'd talk more often, his usual coldness replaced by a vulnerable honesty. Liana's happy face flushed with warmth as she told him how much she appreciated his kindness. Alexis then produced a small gift, admitting he had asked the chef to prepare some cake since he remembered her love for sweet things. The world felt soft and safe as they sat beneath the canopy of trees, the golden light filtering through the leaves as they shared a quiet moment of peace. Liana praised his brilliance in the negotiations with Sable, her admiration for his ability to prevent war shining in her eyes. But then, a shadow crossed his face as he spoke of a time when he was powerless to protect someone dear to him, his hands clenching in a silent vow never to be weak again. He spoke of a future where he would care for the people, not just wage wars, and Liana found herself captivated by the man beneath the crown. He apologized if such talk bored her, but Liana leaned in, insisting that she found his vision fascinating and wanted to hear everything he had to say. Alexis looked at her, moved by her genuine interest, his violet eyes softening even further. Yet, the peace was short-lived. Back within the safety of her quarters, Liana was haunted by the mention of that mysterious person dear to the prince. She wondered if he had meant Richelotte, or perhaps someone she had never known. She tried to shake the thoughts from her head, but a sudden knock at the door startled her. Lance stepped into the room, his gaze immediately falling on the book Alexis had given her. His voice was like ice. He questioned her growing closeness to the prince, demanding to know where the volume had come from. Lance asked what she truly thought of Prince Alexis, his green eyes searching her face for any sign of betrayal. Liana tried to defend him, arguing that while the Empire was their enemy, Alexis was a man of honor who respected their fallen nation. Lance's face darkened with a mixture of jealousy and fear as he commanded her never to go near the prince again. The moon watched over the tense confrontation as Lance insisted that she had gotten too close, crossing a line that no knight should ever cross with a superior. Liana's eyes widened in shock as he accused her of being interested in the prince as a man. She clenched her fist, arguing that she was only gathering information, but Lance countered that the risk of her identity being exposed was far too high. He stared her down, his heart breaking as he asked if information was truly the only reason she refused to stay away. Liana's mind flashed to Alexis, his gentle smile and the way he looked at her, and she told herself it was impossible. She hoped Lance was mistaken, but he was a man who always noticed her changes before she did. Liana clutched her chest, the weight of her own feelings finally becoming a burden she could no longer ignore. Lance's voice rose as he shouted that her safety was more important than any honor, his hands grabbing her shoulders in a desperate plea. He left her alone in the silence, the door clicking shut like a final judgment as the book remained on her desk, a silent witness to her turmoil. Liana sat in the dark, realizing that the Empire was her enemy and that Alex was a prince she should never love. She closed her eyes, trying to banish the image of his smile and replace it with the memories of the war and the blood that had been shed. Meanwhile, deep within the imperial palace, the stench of decay and ambition filled the air. Roderick stood by the bedside of the dying emperor, his respectful facade masking a heart of pure venom. To the emperor, he was a loyal servant, but internally he recoiled in disgust at having to cling to a dying man for power. His plan was clear. If his daughter Sharon was chosen as the next consort, his grip on the empire would become unbreakable. He smirked into the shadows, knowing that the emperor's worsening condition was the perfect shroud for his treachery. Alexis, too, felt the weight of the coming storm, sitting alone in his chambers and fighting the urge to reach out to Liana. He knew he must ignore his feelings, for his duty was to the crown and the stability of the realm. When Roderick arrived to report the emperor's decline and prepare for the worst, Alexis could only look away with a cold, distant gaze. He felt a complex mix of emotions as his father neared death, remembering the bloodshed for the empire's glory. His own dream of a peaceful empire had never aligned with his father's violent path. He had once planned to force his father into retirement, but now that seemed unnecessary. As the pressure to marry and produce an heir grew, Roderick urged him to select a consort quickly for the sake of the empire. Alexis looked at a map of the border where a new mine had been discovered, realizing it was a perfect excuse to leave the capital. He agreed to as soon as possible, but he knew the political cost. If Sharon accompanied him, the world would assume she was his chosen bride. Yet, he realized the region was close to where a certain man resided, a chance to meet him that he could not pass up. Back at the barracks, Liana was surprised when a fellow knight invited her to join the guard for the prince's inspection visit. She agreed, hoping for one last glimpse of him, but as they arrived at the palace gates, her heart shattered. There stood Alexis, cold and regal, with Sharon draped elegantly on his arm. The whispers of the crowd were like daggers, praising how perfectly they suited one another as future rulers. Liana clutched her chest, the H there finally forcing her to acknowledge the truth. She was in love with the enemy. She felt heartbroken seeing him with another woman, realizing that while he was a prince of the empire, she was just a girl who had lost everything. She watched them walk toward the carriage, the distance between them feeling like an unbridgeable chasm. She vowed to seal her feelings away forever for the sake of her country. But inside the carriage, Sharon leaned toward Alexis, her eyes glinting with a secret knowledge. She whispered that her father had something vital to tell him, something about the fall of Canarie and the truth about Liana. The carriage rumbles through the lush, sprawling meadows as it crosses into Marquise Bardel's territory, a land where every blade of grass seems to whisper of old secrets and new schemes. Upon their arrival, a servant bows deeply, ushering the statuesque Prince Alexis toward the grand manor. Walking with a grace that borders on the divine, the prince is accompanied by Lady Sharon, whose vibrant red hair catches the sunlight like a flickering flame. The air is thick with the hushed murmurs of commoners and servants alike. They're following the pair as they gossip about how the lady is never far from the prince's side. Alexis, however, remains cold and observant, his violet eyes scanning the horizon as he senses the political influence of the surrounding families beginning to close in around him like a tightening noose. Inside the mansion, the morning light spills through the tall windows, illuminating the opulence of the Bardell estate. A meeting is convened around a polished table, the prince sitting with a posture that commands absolute obedience. While the Marquis discusses tax revenues and the potential for regional development, the prince's mind remains sharp and calculating, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of royal indifference. The inspection of the territory proceeds without a hitch, the Marquis and Sharon hanging on the prince's every word. The Marquis offers his humble gratitude for the prince's support, and Alexis acknowledges that the proposals put forth were sound, his voice dropping an octave as he maintains his regal distance. Seizing the moment, the Marquis implores the prince to spend the rest of his stay relaxing at the estate rather than at a common inn. Though Alexis looks skeptical, the Marquis insists that his home is far safer. While Sharon rubs her hands together, her face alight with a joy that seems far too rehearsed. Alexis eventually relents, though his gaze remains thoughtful as he secretly plans to see another person the very next day. That evening, the prince stands alone in his chambers, his heart heavy with the weight of his crown. Outside, the estate is bathed in the cool, silver light of the moon, a beautiful prison that prevents him sneaking out for fear of the risk to his reputation. Over dinner, he offers polite, calculated praise for the meal, which the Marquis accepts with a flourish of pride. The servants hover in the background, invisible witnesses to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Suddenly, the Marquis shifts the conversation to a matter of grave importance regarding Lady Sharon's earlier concerns. He speaks of Liana, the brilliant strategist, and claims that voices among the nobility are rising in concern over her continued stay in the kingdom. Alexis's eyes narrow at the suggestion that Liana should be sent back to her own nation. The Marquis leans forward, his voice low, as he mentions the poisonous rumors spreading through the capital. He asks if the prince has heard the whispers that the only reason a woman with no backing could become a strategist is due to a scandalous relationship with Lord Lance. An image of the two of them, seemingly close, flashes through the prince's mind like a jagged shard of glass. Alexis feels a surge of icy jealousy, his gaze sharpening as he struggles to reconcile the rumors with the woman he knows. He demands proof of such unsavory methods, but the Marquis merely sighs, claiming a capable strategist would never leave evidence and imploring the prince to be cautious. Alexis looks at him, his expression void of warmth as he begins to see the true face of the man before him. The next morning, the carriage wheels churn against the earth as Alexis prepares to depart. He announces that he has one more order of business to attend to alone, firmly rebuffing Sharon when she attempts to accompany him. He looks stern, his voice cold as he reminds her that this is an official duty. The Marquis restrains his daughter, telling her not to trouble the prince, though Sharon's face is a mask of suppressed anger. As the carriage pulls away, the Marquis wears a dark, satisfied smirk that suggests his trap is already set. Inside the carriage, the pressure to marry and the rumors about Liana weigh on Alexis like lead. He thinks of the moments they shared and that once she returns to Canarie, they will never meet freely again. He sighs, the brief moment of peace already feeling like a distant memory. The thought of her and Lance being more than acquaintances haunts him, his heart pounding against his ribs as he imagines them starting a family together. He eventually clutches his head in frustration, wondering why he is even entertaining such agonizing thoughts. The carriage continues its journey, the wheels turning relentlessly. Alexis finally arrives at his destination and commands his guard to wait behind. He walks alone through the dense, sun-dappled woods, arriving at a secluded gate. He enters the grounds of a quiet, hidden home, and finds Emerio tending to the garden. Emerio turns, a gentle smile touching his lips as he recognizes the royal visitor. He greets the prince warmly, noting it has been a long time since their last meeting. Standing together in the quiet garden, Alexis offers a rare, genuine smile. Emerio assures him that he has been doing fine thanks to the prince's generosity, but asks what could have brought Alexis there so suddenly after 3 years. Alexis explains he was passing by, but his eyes turn serious as he reveals he has a question to ask. He wants to know the truth about that night 10 years ago. Emerio's face turns solemn. Memories of the past resurface, of the day Alexis and his men saved Emerio from a certain execution. Despite the Empire killing his parents, Emerio could never resent the prince who gave him a life. Back in the present, Emerio asks what the prince seeks to know. Alexis demands to know what truly happened to Richelotte. He confesses that his own investigation found the official reports impossible. A stone castle could not have burned to ash so easily in a violent thunderstorm. He accuses Emerio of faking the princess's death during the identification process, and asks if the burned was truly hers. Alexis's gaze is suffocatingly intense. Sits across from him, and asks what the prince would do if it were true that he helped her escape. Alexis vows that if she is alive, he will protect her with everything he has, seeking to atone for the burden she was forced to bear as a child. He demands the truth once more. Emerio watches him, realizing that ever since that night, the prince's bright smile has been replaced by a heavy, solemn air. Emerio explains that the invasion was senseless, and that on the night of fire, he tried to save his sister by entrusting her to a knight he trusted deeply. Chaos descended as the flames took hold. Emerio walked through the blood-stained halls, finding only a blue gem ornament among the ashes. Soldiers arrived, claiming they had found the princess's corpse, and used the jewel as proof of her death. Emerio had no choice but to nod back then, but he has never stopped believing that she is still alive somewhere out there. Alexis listens, the silence between them heavy with the weight of a decade of secrets. Meanwhile, at the training grounds, Liana is hard at work taking notes. Sharon arrives with food for the knights, her presence a calculated display of grace. Internally, however, Sharon is a storm of jealousy, cursing the incompetent fools who failed to get rid of Liana when she was alone. She approaches Liana with a false smile, offering her food, and claiming she only wants to support the prince. Liana feels a cold shiver of dread, her hand tightening on her uniform. Sharon then asks if Liana doesn't wish to return to Canarie soon. Later, Liana remains steadfast, stating her intention to finish her assignment. Sharon calls her remarkable for a commoner in a foreign land, her voice dripping with condescension. She asks if Liana isn't worried about her own future while Sharon prepares to marry the prince. Liana realizes with a heavy heart that Sharon truly loves Alexis, and she is left standing alone as the redhead walks away with a triumphant air. Nearby, Lord Lance watches Liana, noticing her lack of motivation. He senses her feelings for Alexis, but believes there is no path for them to be together. He wants her to be happy simply as Liana, free from the tragedy of her past. He decides he must be the one to give her something to look forward to, and asks to discuss something important. That night, Liana walks through the grass, remembering Alexis's warning to stay away from Lance. She wonders if Lance has found out the truth about Roan. Under the glow of a full moon, she finds Lance waiting for her. They talk about the stars, reminiscing about the nights they spent watching the sky together in their youth. Liana smiles at the memory, but Lance's face is etched with a desperate resolve as he calls her name. Liana asks what he wants to talk about. Under the silver moonlight, Lance suddenly asks her to marry him. Liana is in shock, her heart pounding. She mentions an offer to be adopted by a noble family in Canarie, a move that would give her a strong position. Lance admits he only wanted her to be happy, but he believes that if she chooses Alexis, there is no future for her. He begs to be the one to make her happy. Liana looks sad, telling him he doesn't have to feel responsible for her. Lance looks away, his voice trembling with emotion. He reminds her that he has always protected her, but he confesses that he loves her not as a brother, but as a woman. Under the vast starlit sky, he asks one final time if she will spend the rest of her life with him. Under the silver glow of the moon, the house stood silent as the wind carried a promise of happiness. Liana's breathed in her throat, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. He spoke of the heavy burden of the past, his voice a low rumble as he vowed that Roan's honor would be restored and her family's legacy would no longer be a source of shame. He searched her face, asking if her kin would not desire the very same peace he was offering. Liana stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing against her chest like a physical force. Visions of her lost parents flooded her mind, their faces blurred by time, but their love still a burning ember in her soul. She remembered her brother Emerio, the pain of their separation a sharp edge that made her hand tremble against her heart as she swore to reclaim what was stolen. The man before her softened, his intimidating presence yielding to a gentleness she hadn't expected as he offered to walk this path slowly side by side. He reached out, his hand a steady anchor in the swirling storm of her emotions. When his fingers brushed her cheek, her heart hammered against her ribs, a scent of white flowers blooming in the cool night air. He urged her to reflect deeply on his proposal, his gaze lingering on her before he finally turned to depart. She watched his retreating figure under the vast, starlit sky, her mind a chaotic whirl of disbelief. The mention of marriage had sent a feverish blush to her cheeks, leaving her breathless and reeling. She knew him well enough to realize he was capable of jesting about such a sacred bond, and the reality of his seriousness made her knees weak. As dawn broke over the sprawling imperial palace, the sun glinted off the golden spires, signaling a new chapter. Inside his private study, Prince Alexis sat at his ornate desk, the scratches of his pen the only sound in the oppressive silence. He set the quill aside, his violet eyes cold and calculating as he reviewed the letter he had just completed. The need for action burned within him, a restlessness that demanded he test his mettle. Grasping the hilt of his sword, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility and the sharp edge of a lingering mystery. Every step he took through the hallowed halls haunted by the possibility that Richelotte might still be breathing, hidden somewhere in the shadows of the world. The prince's face was a mask of stoic determination, yet his thoughts were a labyrinth of what-ifs. He envisioned the silver-haired girl of his youth, wondering if she was living a quiet life in some distant land, far from the reach of those who destroyed her home. His suspicions began to coalesce around the mysterious woman from Canarie, whose striking features were a mirror image of the princess he once knew. Deep within the palace gardens, Liana walked among the trees, seeking a moment of respite from the suffocating secrets she carried. She was unaware of the predator-like gaze following her from the thicket, the prince's boots silent on the forest floor. She longed for a simple happiness, a life where she could truly be herself. But the path forward felt obscured by thorns. When they finally stood face to face in the dappled sunlight, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Alexis stared at her, his composure momentarily faltering as he took in her appearance. He questioned if she was being mistreated, his voice sharp with a protective instinct he couldn't quite hide. His eyes searched hers, seeking the truth behind her guarded expression. Liana quickly tried to dismiss his concerns, her hands fluttering as she explained she only sought to clear her mind in the solitude of the woods. A faint smile touched the prince's lips as he offered to guide her to a place far more beautiful than this secluded path. As they walked together, the prince struck by the haunting similarity between the woman beside him and the girl who had vanished 10 years ago. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, his heart a battlefield of logic and hope. It seemed impossible that she could be here, yet every gesture she made felt like a ghost from his past. Liana's gentle smile was like a dagger to his heart, making him question the irrationality of his own desires. They crossed a threshold into a hidden sanctuary, where a sea of vibrant blue flowers swayed in the breeze. Liana's eyes sparkled with genuine joy, her laughter a melodic sound that echoed through the clearing. Alex watched her, noting that this peaceful grove was his only refuge from the world. She touched the petals with reverence, remembering the very same flowers from a book he had once shared with her in another life. He asked if the sight pleased her, his voice dropping to a tender whisper. Seeing her radiant face, the image of the young Richelotte overlapped with the woman before him, shattering the last of his doubts. Liana sensed the change in him, a vulnerability that made her pause and ask what was troubling his mind. He confessed that he felt trapped by the weight of a decade-long failure. He spoke of the day Roan fell, the bitterness of his own powerlessness still tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at her, seeing not just a soldier of Canarie, but the strategist and the princess who had always commanded his attention. He realized that if she had survived that horrific night, she would have sought refuge in a place exactly like this. In her nervousness, Liana accidentally revealed her true age, a slip of the tongue that made her heart skip a beat. She realized he was looking at her differently now, his gaze piercing through her disguise. Alexis stood motionless, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place with a deafening roar in his mind. The modest princess had become a dignified woman, but the soul beneath remained unchanged. He stepped closer, the words "you are" trembling on his lips as the wind whipped around them. Petals danced in the air, blurring the world until only the two of them remained. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he gently plucked a stray petal from her hair. The intimacy of the gesture triggered a flood of memories for Liana, a sense of déjà vu that left her breathless. She saw a vision of them as children, a moment of innocence frozen in time before the world turned to blood and fire. Her eyes widened in realization as the truth crashed down upon her. Alexis finally spoke the name that had been a prayer on his lips for 10 years, Richelotte. Liana felt her heart thundering against her ribs, the wall she had built around herself crumbling in an instant. She tried to feign ignorance, her voice shaking as she asked whose name he was calling. She looked away, her face burning with a blush that gave her away more than any words could. Alexis didn't let her retreat, his presence suffocating and all-encompassing as he watched her every move. He picked a single purple flower, the color of his own eyes, and tucked it behind her ear with a reverence that made her tremble. He told her it looked beautiful on a princess, his voice thick with emotion. Liana realized then that he had never forgotten, that he had carried the memory of her in his heart through every dark year. Before she could speak, he pulled her into a crushing embrace, as if trying to shield her from the entire world. She gasped against his chest, the warmth of his body a shocking contrast to the cold life she had led. He thanked her for surviving, his voice cracking as he promised to be her ally and never let her hide again. He apologized for the failure of his younger self, his regret a tangible thing between them. This time, he vowed, he would protect her with his very life. They stood together in the field of blue, two brokens finding pieces of themselves in the other. Liana's hand rose to touch his shoulder, her fingers gripping the fabric of his uniform as she finally allowed herself to lean into him. They held each other, as the 10 years of separation could be erased by the sheer force of their embrace. Sitting together among the flowers, they began the long task of weaving their lives back together. Tears pricked her eyes as she learned that her brother was not only alive, but safe. He showed her a jewel, a token of an engagement and a bond that had never truly been severed. He asked why I'd risk everything to come to the heart of the Empire. Her hand brushed the grass as she confessed her desperate need for the truth. She had lived in fear that her homeland would be dragged into another war, and she couldn't stand by while more blood was shed. Alexis looked at her with profound admiration, noting how the shy girl had transformed into a woman of incredible resilience. He took her hand, calling her dazzling and wonderful, his heart finally melting for the woman who had returned from the dead. A rare, genuine smile illuminated his face, a sight that made Liana's pulse race. Surrounded by the beauty of the garden, she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in a decade. She looked at him, her resolve hardening. She had one final request that she needed him to fulfill. She demanded to know the full truth of what happened to Roan on that fateful day. Alexis's expression darkened, warning her that the details would be agonizing to hear. Liana met his gaze with unwavering strength, her hand over her heart as she declared she was prepared for whatever pain the truth might bring. As night fell once more, they retreated to the shadows of the palace library. They pored over dusty ledgers and secret reports, the evidence of a grand betrayal laid bare before them. Something was fundamentally wrong with the official records of the invasion. The maps showed a web of lies involving Roan and the hostile nation of Beldia. Alexis pointed to the man who had orchestrated the entire catastrophe, his voice cold with a promise of vengeance. The palace stood like a silent witness to the coming storm. Roderick Bardel and the treacherous Sharon arrived, their faces masks of arrogance and greed. Roderick entered the prince's office with a false smile, thanking him for the audience. Alexis sat behind his desk, a king in all but name, his presence suffocatingly cold. With a single sharp gesture, the trap was sprung. Guards seized Roderick, pinning his arms behind his back as his face contorted in sudden terror. Beamed in confusion, but Alexis simply uttered his name with a chilling finality. The prince's eyes were like chips of ice as he looked down at the traitor. He accused him of filing the false reports that had triggered the slaughter of an entire kingdom. Roderick's voice cracked as he tried to claim there was a mistake, his desperation filling the room. Alexis's gaze only grew sharper, a predatory glint in his eyes. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed on the marble floor. The prince asked if the traitor would dare maintain his lies of the very people he had destroyed. Emerio stepped into the light, his blonde hair a beacon of the royal line that was supposed to be extinct. Roderick's face drained of all color, his eyes bulging as he realized the Prince of Roan was alive. Sharon's composure shattered as she recognized Liana standing beside him. The villains stood paralyzed as the survivors of their cruelty loomed over them. Sharon shrieked, her voice a shrill cacophony as she branded them sinners and demanded they be removed. Alexis thundered for her to be silent, his voice shaking the very walls as he laid out the conspiracy Bardel had formed with the Knight Commander. Bardel tried to demand proof, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Alexis revealed the secret investigation and the testimony of those who had seen the supplagans. Liana stepped forward, her voice steady as she pointed out the fatal flaw in their lie. The bridge they claimed to have used was under repair and impassable. The memory of the staged accident and the deaths of the smugglers was brought back to light. The secret lineage of the guards involved pointed directly back to the Bardel family. Under interrogation, the truth had finally poured out, revealing the wagon accident as a pathetic charade. Alexis sneered at their poor loyalty, noting how quickly their men had talked when faced with a reduced sentence. He turned his fury on Sharon, accusing her of ordering the assassination attempt on Liana in the city. With a final crushing decree, he sentenced them both to a death they could not escape. Sharon's screams for mercy were ignored, her face a mask of ugly desperation. Alexis looked at her with nothing but disgust as he ordered her to the dungeons. He turned his back on them, a gesture of absolute finality. Sharon was dragged away, her delusions of becoming empress echoing through the halls until the heavy doors slammed shut. Silence returned to the room as the survivors stood together. Alexis bowed his head, apologizing once more for the years of suffering his kingdom had caused. Liana stepped toward him, her blue eyes soft as she told him the fault was not his. Alexis took her hand, vowing to restore Roan's glory and atone for every drop of blood spilled. Emerio watched them, a sad smile on his face as he acknowledged that while the past was written in stone, the future was theirs to mold. The light of justice seemed to fill the room, washing away the shadows of a decade. Liana and Alexis stood side by side, a new alliance forged in the fires of revenge and the promise of a shared future. As the moon rose over the peaceful palace, Liana found her brother on the balcony. Emerio looked at her with a warmth that only a sibling could provide, grateful that they could finally speak without the weight of the world on their shoulders. Beneath the vast starlit sky, the ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest, leaving only the quiet peace of the night.